Welcome back to another inspiring episode of Fantastic Friday. I'm your host, Jonathan Frederick. I'm going to be doing something new here, which is recording directly onto YouTube and simultaneously recording it for the podcast platform as it's been up until this point. It looks like I have to adjust the gain on the audio right now. Let's take 2 seconds. So bear with me. Okay, that should work. Now, today's episode, I'm going to talk about being an outlier versus an outcast, and not confusing the two. So we're going to jump onto Google right here. Now, the word outlier, when I think about it, I think about Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, and where he essentially outlines, where he talks about the difference, or not the difference, but he talks about what an outlier is. But I'm going to Google outlier. And outlier, a person or thing situated away or detached from the main body or system. I want to do the difference between an outlier and an outcast. So I'm going to also Google outcast. Let's see what it says. Outcast, as defined at by the dictionary, noun, a person who has been rejected by society or a social group. Synonyms are pariah, a reject, untouchable. Okay, synonyms for an outlier are a person. Let's see if there's any. I don't see any synonyms for outlier. An outlier is an that's an observation point that is distant from other observations. Okay, so an outlier. There's two different ways of looking at yourself as an entrepreneur, a business owner, or just somebody who thinks of things a little differently. Definitely recommend picking up Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers. But for the purpose of this episode, I want to delve into the difference between outliers and an outcast, because I want you to know, if you're watching this video, for the people listening to this on the audio format, you're not an outcast unless you choose to look at yourself as a reject. What is even a reject, right? It's still a self-pitying, prideful, and I'm just going to preface this episode by saying you may really not like hearing this, or you may be like, oh, that's a good point, I didn't really think about it. So I'm really sharing with you guys, as I always say, where I'm at and what I've been realizing. And the other day it hit me while I was watching my buddy, shout out to Kerry Hokama, on Instagram. He was doing something with his buddies, and he said that they are outliers, and I was immediately impressed with the point that being an outcast and being an outlier are completely different. But you may be an outlier falsely identifying as a reject or an outcast to give yourself some kind of self-perceived importance or significance, to identify with a group of people that call themselves rejects or unacceptable, or just, oh, people don't get me, so I'm an outcast. You're not an outcast. Maybe you just need to improve your social skills and get out more. At the end of the day, I'm just being honest, because I used to kind of view myself as an outcast, not so much like sitting in self-pity. I always tried to push myself, learn how to be better with people, learn how to actually show up how I want to show up, not manipulatively, but in a way of, this is how I see myself, and how come I'm not showing up in this way with people, in a sincere way? Because if you're allowing your own insecurities or your past experiences, or even your past being burned by people in the past, or communities, things like that, keep you from continuously showing up, you can start to falsely identify with feeling like an outcast. And all of us at times, I believe, feel like an outcast. The point I'm trying to make is that you may just be an outlier, which is somebody who does think differently from the norm, from societal norms, which anyone listening to this podcast, I would guess that you probably are an outlier in that way. You think differently. You have different outlooks on different things than most of society would say. You're maybe seen as a contrarian when it comes to things like finance or business or capitalism, stuff like that. And when it comes to being a contrarian, it's not for the sake of being contrary to what everyone else thinks or says. That's just obnoxious and annoying. It's not for the sake of anything. It's just that you tend to think differently. And it's not to say you're more significant or your viewpoints are more woke or more important than others. It's just to say, based on your experiences, what you've read, what you've learned, how you've developed and been developed, you are seeing things largely different than the large majority of society. And it's not saying anything about I'm smarter or I know better than society at all. It's more so the fact of you're not an outcast. You actually are just an outlier in that you think differently, and that's okay. You don't have to look at yourself like, oh, I'm an outcast. No one gets me. No one understands. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm going to go and get it. I'm going to prove everyone wrong. Like, cool. That only lasts so long before you burn out. That's not a lasting motivation. Your motivation should be rooted in love. It shouldn't be rooted in anger or frustration or rage. It should be rooted in love, because that's an endless power supply from God. The love of God is an endless power supply. I learned that mainly through, obviously scripture, and then we had to guess Rob Reamer on, I think it was episode 16 or 17 about soul care. And, he talked about that. He said, because I talked to him after the show, I was like, look, man, like I'm still dealing with anger. I still deal with wanting to prove people wrong. I definitely have a bit of a chip on my shoulder that I manage quite well at this point, but I still feel like I have that chip. And when I say prove people wrong, don't read into that. I don't mean everyone I meet or anything like that. Like, that's hyper insecure. It's just rooted in perhaps some past wounds or anything. So that's why I was really interested in soul care, and still am. Um, it's just interesting when you start to see the truth of, hey, maybe I'm an outlier. I'm not necessarily an outcast. And that's encouraging to a lot of people. I hope it's encouraging to you. Definitely pick up the book Outlier by Malcolm Gladwell. The point of that book is he talks a lot about how outliers tend to be way more successful than, obviously, outcasts, but he doesn't really talk about outcasts as much as outliers would include people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, people who did big things in the world. And to be an outlier, I think you have to be willing to be judged, for sure. You have to be willing to be taken unseriously for a long time. As the quote goes, first people will completely ignore you, then they treat you like you're insignificant, then they actually try to detract you or hate on you, so to speak, and then they start to model you or try to get advice from you or say, wow, you're successful. I knew you would be successful all along. And it's just a cycle. It's how it goes. When you understand how these patterns, I'm still learning so much. The more I learn, the more I figure out that I actually don't know. And so what I'm trying to share here is that the more you start to understand human nature and the patterns of human nature, the less judgmental it can help you to decompress that valve of judgmental or cynicism towards people who may not understand you or what you're doing. And don't expect anyone to, obviously. It's not for them. It's not particularly their dream. It's yours. Or maybe it's, maybe you're living your life to honor God, which I would hope. And therefore, you're trying to live out the vision that you believe He has given to you for His glory. And, it's really interesting. But at the end of the day, even in doing things that you know or that you genuinely believe to be right, you should always be open to not just anyone, but you should always be open to the fact that you could be wrong, and especially in certain ways or in certain facets or certain areas of that vision that you believe so strongly is perhaps even divinely inspired from God. And so don't get it twisted. You're not an outcast. If you feel like an outcast, ask yourself why. A lot of people I meet, and I identify really well with people who would probably identify as outcasts, the people who are self-perceived rejects, or they just, here's the thing, guys. Do you want to stay feeling like that? Like, maybe it gives you a self-importance or some significance to believe, hey, I'm an outcast. Like, people don't get me. I think differently. I'm on this spectrum, whatever it may be. Maybe it gives you some form of significance or self-perceived importance to think that way. That, oh, I identify with this. The reality is, do you want that? Like, how is that serving your life? How is that going to allow you to be used more effectively? How is that going to help anything? So what I would challenge us to do is to consistently ask better questions of ourselves, of other people, of the information we're consuming, and to constantly be looking to improve our. Let me gather my thoughts here. And to be constantly improving the level of honesty that we are looking at the world with. The objectivity. Or is it subjective? Is it objectivity? Let me just Google this. I always been confusing these lately. Objective. I think it's subjective. Oh no. Objective means impartial, unbiased, unprejudiced, nonpartisan, non-discriminatory, neutral, uninvolved, even-handled. So objectively versus subjectively. So you're not taking circumstances into account. You're just looking at it objectively. Get outside yourself more often. If you're identifying as an outcast and you think that it's because you are different in some capacity, maybe you're more of an outlier. So I'm not saying this to like woo-woo make you feel good about yourself or be motivational or anything. I'm genuinely just trying to share with you what I've been realizing. I haven't identified as an outcast ever because I recognize the toxicity in that identification, thankfully. And I also know I'm loved and accepted by God. So at the end of the day, that's all I need. I'm content. I'm good. That's enough. So that being said, too, the way that you show up in society, whether or not you believe in God, is difficult when you think of it as if you are an outcast or you're a reject or people don't get you. Because even the thing is, even if you do identify that way, there are other people who identify with you in that. So you're actually not a reject. There's always a group, which I'm not a huge fan of grouping people together, but my point is there's always a way to belong and to help others feel like they belong. And that's important. That's really important. Always have the selfless and others-focused attitude of making people feel that they belong, because we all do. And so even if you don't agree with people or you have completely differing opinions, civil discourse, respect, giving people the time of day, it's all very important to living a life well lived, in my opinion. And again, take it with a grain of salt. Have an awesome, freaking fantastic Friday. I hope it's epic. I hope it's genuinely relaxing. I hope you get some rest, some time with your friends, family, loved ones, whatever that may look like. I really want this weekend to be a special one for you. I appreciate you listening to this episode, and I will see you on Monday for an incredible interview. These interviews are really just becoming we'll see you on Monday. Oh, as always, live wide open and Godspeed.